Teenagers have a lot of insight. And one of the, I think, ongoing themes of the young people I spoke to in this book was feeling like nobody was listening to them because they're teenagers.
Welcome to the Nieman Storyboard Podcast, where we dig into the craft of journalism and storytelling. I'm Mark Armstrong, editor of Nieman Storyboard. This show is brought to you by the Nieman Foundation for Journalism at Harvard. You can get updates by signing up for our newsletter. Just go to niemanstoryboard.org to sign up. My guest today is journalist Claudia Rowe, author of the narrative nonfiction book Wards of the State, The Long Shadow of American Foster Care. The book was published in May of this year and is now a finalist for the National Book Awards, to be handed out in November. The book examines the failures of the American foster care system, as told through the stories of 6 former foster kids. Rowe shared some important lessons for journalists about trauma-informed reporting, about how to work with young people to tell their stories, and how to cover a system that makes it difficult to obtain public information in the first place. Claudia has been covering youth issues and government policy for more than 3 decades. She's the recipient of the Casey Medal for Meritorious Journalism, and her work has been twice nominated for the Pulitzer Prize. She's been published in the New York Times, the Seattle Times, Mother Jones, and The Stranger. And in 2018, her memoir, The Spider and the Fly, won the Washington State Book Award. So without further ado, here's my conversation with Claudia Rowe. So, Claudia, thank you again for being here.
Thanks so much for having me. It's great to talk with you.
Congratulations on the book. Congratulations on the National Book Awards. How did you learn about that?
Thank you. Complete shock. I had no idea that the book had been submitted or was under consideration. Just none. I got this email in the morning, and I literally thought somebody had hacked my email or somebody else's email. I thought I had been spammed. It said, congrats on the NBA, and my kid is really into basketball, and I thought it had something to do with the NBA basketball league. So yes, it was a complete shock. It's really great. What is really great about it is I think it's a recognition about the importance of the issues that this book, Wards of the State, is looking at. You know, when judges highlight a book, my competitive jock basketball kid goes, oh, does that mean it's the best in the country? No, it doesn't mean that. What it means is that some judges liked it and they thought that the issue it is spotlighting is something that we all need to think about. And that is why that recognition means so much to me.
How did this turn into a book project for you? How did it start?
I've been a journalist 34 years. All that time, I have been covering sort of what I think of as youth and the system. So youth in public education, youth in juvenile justice, youth in the child welfare system. So it's all these sort of government systems that interact with or clash with young people. I didn't set out to plan that as a beat, but that is what has evolved. So while I had written about foster care here and there over the years a little bit, I would say of those 3 areas, it was probably the one I had the least depth in, the least familiarity with. And certainly what this book focuses on, which is realities for older kids in foster care. I had maybe written like 2 pieces about what happens when kids age out at 18 and the incredible rates of homelessness that result because kids age out with very little support and very poor educational background in general. So it's no surprise that, 30% end up homeless very quickly. However, none of that was on my mind when this book came to me. I was sitting in court. I was watching a teenage girl being sentenced for murder. I was there because I was interested in a forensic psychologist who was maybe going to talk about what he thought her sentence should be. She had pled guilty, and so now there was this sentencing proceeding. He was going to testify for the prosecution and say she should be locked up for like 20 years. This is very unusual for him, this guy who testified usually for the defense. In this case, he was not. I was interested in his work, so he invited me to come and listen to his testimony. What happened is that he never was called to the stand. He never spoke. But instead, the case of this girl, which had not really been my real reason for being in the courtroom, ended up kind of consuming me. The sentencing hearing, which was supposed to be, a couple of hours one day, ended up being continued and continued over the course of 3 days, stretching over 6 weeks. So by the end of that, I really had a much deeper sense of the case. And I was really intrigued by the argument that this teenage girl's defense team was attempting to make, that the foster care system was largely to blame for what she had done. This really intrigued me. I had not heard that kind of argument made before, though I knew plenty about foster care. And in watching this teenager kind of hear the testimony about her from the prosecution, which was arguing for, I think, a 24-year sentence. This really rang a bell with me because I had, in fact, covered, as I mentioned, what happens to older youth when they age out. And while this girl had committed her crime at 16 and she was now locked up, so she wasn't going to be, aging out in that sense, the data from the early 2000s had stuck in my mind because it showed what seemed to me incredibly high rates of incarceration for former foster kids. This was data out of the Midwest, but it was sort of nationally representative. And it said that 59% of kids who age out of the system at 18 will have been locked up somewhere, somehow, by the time they're 26. 59% incarceration rate for foster kids. This just blew my mind because this is a system we say is better than where they came from. And this is the result, 59% incarceration rate. That kind of clanged in my head as I was watching this girl being sentenced in Seattle for murder. And then I'm thinking about the argument that her defense team is making about the role of foster care in her crime. And I'm thinking about these numbers for homeless youth right out of the foster care system. Like I said, 30%. These numbers are so high that I began to wonder if maybe the system really was doing something to encourage or even create these outcomes, just as this defense team was arguing. They were not successful with the judge. He gave this teenager a 19-year sentence. So their argument didn't really carry a whole lot of weight, obviously, with him, but it really intrigued me. And so I sort of set out to investigate that question. How exactly does this happen? Why are so many kids getting locked up out of foster care, which is supposed to be saving them? That was the genesis of the book.
And was the woman whose trial you were at, was that Marianne?
Yes.
And so Marianne becomes one of the main characters in your book. And was it always going to be that way? How did you start to sort of dig into this question?
She was, sort of my opening into this inquiry, right? Marianne was my way into this inquiry. And I did think of her as a character in the book right from the start. But I didn't really know what else the book would be. So I did... right after the sentencing, she was in the King County Jail, waiting to be brought to prison. It turned out that a teacher in Seattle, an educator I had known for many years as an education reporter, had worked with Marianne earlier in her life. She knew Marianne. And she was all wrapped up in this case, not that she was involved with it, but she was concerned about it. And she went to visit Marianne in jail, and she said she would take a note to Marianne for me. I wanted to kind of find a way to introduce myself without just landing in front of her, She's a 19-year-old girl at this point. I mean, she's a 19-year-old young woman, whatever term you want to say. She's still a teenager, and she's facing, 2 decades in state prison. I figured, a little go-between would probably be smart. So I gave this educator a note, and she gave it to Marianne. And then I went to the jail. There was no appointment, there was no setup, there was no permission, there was no nothing. I was just a visitor at the jail. But Marianne had this note, and she had seen me in court. There was some media attention around her case, but not a ton. And so, I'm sitting in court in the jury box, which, a lot of reporters will know that when there is a case in court and there is not a jury to hear that particular part of it, often judges will let media sit in the jury box. We're sitting there so that the regular gallery can have more room for friends and family of the people involved, for other onlookers, for other attorneys. So there I am sitting in the jury box, which is, like 3 feet away from the defense table where Marianne is sitting. So I was, there were maybe 2 other reporters there. She saw me every day of those 3 days of the sentencing. I was really close. She surely saw me like looking at her intently. And so when I showed up in jail saying, yes, I'm the person who wrote that note, she was not surprised. She already had seen me. I did not expect an interview that day. I just wanted to sort of pitch my idea, which was not a terribly well-formed idea at that point. I just said, hey, I want to understand how this happened to you, and there are thousands like you. Marianne recognized that immediately. She definitely understood she had a story to tell, but she knew she was not the only one with that story. And she was, from the beginning, riveted on explaining the experience, her own experience, because she knew it was relevant to so many other kids coming up behind her who she would never know. That was originally, I think, why she wanted to talk to me. Mm-hmm. And so I said, great. And then, I think like the next day she was whisked off to prison. It was just luck that I got in there before she was gone. Because as some will know, when a person is brought to prison, they are not always immediately available to visitors for interviews. There's a whole kind of processing period where they're evaluated and placed, and there's sort of this long limbo. So I was really, really lucky that I happened to get in and make my pitch to her before she was sort of gone into the maw of this enormous carceral system.
Yeah, it seems like there are so many different difficulties that present themselves in how you can even begin to cover the foster care system, both in terms of speaking to children, therapists, social workers, speaking to people who are in the prison system. How did you begin to sort of break into that a little bit?
It's a really good point you're making. The idea for this book from the beginning, even as many things changed and evolved, my idea from the beginning was to tell this story as much as possible through the eyes of young people experiencing it. I really wanted to understand, what does it feel like to be on the street when you're 15 years old, it's 2:00 in the morning? Like, what does that feel like? It might be really exciting. I don't know, scary, lonely, whatever it might be. I really wanted to understand how kids understood themselves, how they saw what was happening to them. That is a very difficult thing. Few 15-year-olds can really articulate it, certainly not younger children, right? Like, it's really, really hard for kids to have that perspective on their experience. Also, because what I was looking at was what happens in foster care to older kids so that when they get out, they're like immediately locked up. What is going on there? So it began to make more and more sense to talk with people who were former foster youth, but recently, as much as possible. So Marianne was one of them. There were others. There's somebody in the book younger than Marianne, who was, in fact, 18 when she and I started talking and working together. She's the youngest. That's Tina in the book. And then there were others who are older. And it began to be clear to me not only how incredible these numbers are, how horrible these numbers are, but how long this has been the case. That these off-the-charts incarceration rates are not a new trend or a sudden spike or anything like that. That this has been the case for decades, maybe for more than a century. This overlap between sort of helping kids and then sort of locking them up is an old thing. So in researching all of this, I came across somebody who kind of represented years back, and this was Arthur Longworth, another main character in the book, who received a life sentence for a murder. He committed very shortly after being ejected from Washington State foster care in 1981. He was committing sort of various crimes at that point, and then in 1985 he had killed this young woman in a really awful, brutal crime. Got a life sentence. Art was not originally going to be a character in my book. Art, to me, was a research source. Somebody said, another person who had known Art in prison said, oh, you're researching this connection between foster care and incarceration? You got to talk to this guy, Art Longworth. He knows all about it. Not only did he live it, he is actually studying it from inside prison. You got to talk to him. So that's what I did. I emailed him on the JPay prison email system at the time, and it kind of explained, again, my pitch, what I was trying to do. I wanted Art to help me understand Marianne, because Art had been a teenager on the streets, and I thought he could help me understand her. But in getting to know Art, I realized not only did he have insight, he was also a really good writer. He was a really good writer, and he could articulate this experience of being a teenager on the street. And more than that, he was articulating kind of the emotional state. Like, he was able to speak to this rage that is so common, I've now found, among young people who go through the foster care system. And I saw it over and over in researching the book. Art has a really keen ability to articulate that sort of blinding rage and what it does and how he understood himself. He was able to say all this stuff that I wanted to know. So then, because he was older and represented how long this has been going on, and because he could speak to this emotional state I wanted to get at, he needed to be a character in the book. So I think what I'm trying to say is, in researching exactly how long this has been happening and how, that is how I found my characters. It was true for each of them.
Yeah, because there are others who you've met who become advocates for change in the system and have founded their own nonprofits, right? And then others who go by pseudonyms. Can you tell me a little bit about those who you met, sort of who are now in advocacy?
Sure. Art himself is in advocacy, and I won't give away too many spoilers about what happens to Art, but his story becomes legally really interesting, and he is in advocacy. But another person I met sort of along my journey of running down, how does this happen? Like, what are the mechanisms? And I found that there are really 4 aspects of foster care that seem to channel kids toward incarceration or homelessness. And they are running away, group homes, failed adoptions, and aging out at 18 without support. So I sort of, in the research, I looked at the overlap of numbers, and these 4 aspects were common to like every one of them, at least, if not all, were common to so many young people who ended up incarcerated. And that could be, by the way, I should say, that could be incarcerated even while you're in foster care, like in juvenile detention. You know, it's not all state prison, but at some point you're in a locked cell. In running down each of these 4 aspects, I found this guy, Sixto Cancel, who was also, who is an activist. And he was also himself, former foster kid, trying to collect data on what is happening here. Like, there's all these people independently who don't know one another, sort of at the same time going, wait, what? And all, you know, myself and Art and Sixto, all from our own separate worlds, trying to understand this. Same thing as with Art. I went to Sixto really for help understanding group homes, because Sixto had become an activist, had grown up in foster care, become an activist, and he was working on a report about group homes and the outcomes of group homes. Same thing. In talking with Sixto and learning about his research and how he came to do that research and collect it and get into the position where he's now advising people at the White House, I think, oh, he's totally fascinating. He's a whole different story from Marianne and Art. He's across the country. He grew up in Bridgeport, Connecticut. I think he needs to be in the story too, because he is a different age than they are. Marianne's super young, Art quite old. Sixto was in the middle. He was from a different part of the country, and yet the themes were the same. The themes of alienation, not belonging, feeling lost, feeling like nobody hears you, all this stuff, the same. But I thought it was really important to have someone who hadn't ended up locked up, who had surmounted their very, very difficult childhood. And how did that happen? So again, now you should be a character in this book too. And that is really how it happened with each of them. I did end up speaking with dozens of foster kids who obviously are not major characters in the book, but whose voices kind of informed a lot of the questions I asked my main characters.
So I'm wondering if you could read a passage from the moment that you met Marianne.
All right. Through the protective divider between us, Marianne nodded hello and offered a tentative smile. She said she recognized me from court. I had not planned to conduct an interview, just an introduction, but Marianne seemed eager to talk. The first thing she wanted to discuss was love. The older women in jail who'd taught her to make tattoo ink from baby shampoo and crushed up pencil lead had explained what it was to be a mother with addictions. All of them had children in foster care, and they'd helped Marianne understand how her own mother could have put heroin first. They miss their kids, but the addiction takes over everything, Marianne said wearily. So I forgive my mom. Recordings of their jailhouse phone calls after Marianne's arrest had left me confused. They'd spoken on Mother's Day with frequent I love yous batted back and forth over the line. And when their allotted 20 minutes were up, Marianne said she'd be able to call right back, which she had done. But her mother never picked up. Marianne called and waited and called again. Her mother was gone. This was standard, she told me with a shrug. Yearning for her mom had gotten Marianne into trouble over and over. It had driven her to run from foster homes in hopes of finding her mother on the streets. It had left her waiting in bus stations for hours because her mother had promised to be there. She's kind of like a celebrity that way, Marianne said. Despite her tattoos and jail scrubs and the fact that she'd murdered a man, there was a gentleness to Marianne I had not anticipated, a certain naivete. I distrusted this impression and kept offering her off-ramps, reasons to back away. A book would take years, I said. There would be endless questions, and they would be intrusive, and I would be checking everything she said against her records, which I would also need to see. That's okay, said Marianne. I'm used to it.
What is the period of time in which you're kind of just gathering research and interviews and just taking in whatever you can? Was there a period of time you set for yourself? And then was there a framework in your head? How did you keep things organized in the early days?
I didn't. Okay, I'll just be for real with you. This is kind of how I always do it. It's just sloshing around in a ton of information. And I'm just reading everything, talking to everyone, sort of writing. When I'm really being good, I'll do an interview with somebody and just sort of afterward write it up sort of narratively. But it's just a kind of a blurt, it's not terribly organized. I would call it like an artifact or a little piece of a puzzle, it's like if you think of a mosaic, okay, so I wrote this little 2 pages off of that interview and it's like a little puzzle piece, but it's not a terribly organized approach, I will say. I had all this information. I was getting more and more people who I thought could sort of illustrate or embody these themes that I wanted to explore or these sort of phenomenon in foster care. So each of the main characters illuminates one of these 4 planks of how kids end up incarcerated. So Marianne was like my runaway. She was a chronic runner by the time she committed her crime. Just like a compulsive runner. And I think it's important to say she wasn't running from an abusive foster home. And I think this is a common and understandable misconception. Running away from your placement is really, really, really common in foster care. But much of the time, kids are not running away from an abusive foster parent. They're running toward. They're looking for like their tribe. They're looking for other kids on the street who get them, who know them, who understand their experience. They're looking for the parents who gave them up or who are addicted, who had their rights terminated. Maybe can I just see her again? Can I just find my mom? Marianne was constantly looking for her mom, as do many, many young people in foster care. So they run. They get hungry, they shoplift, the cops pick them up, they go to detention, they just got locked up. They're part of that 59%. Or they get hungry, they're trafficked, they're looking for shelter at night. Again, the cops are eventually going to pick them up if they're out there on the street. They're going to go to detention. It's not really how it's supposed to happen because I haven't technically committed a serious crime, but that is what happens. That is one reason that number 59% is so high. Essentially, when I was pitching this book first to my agent saying, hey, I think I understand what my next book is. She said she was into it right away. But she said, I don't think Marianne is your whole story. I think you need to go bigger. I think you need to go wider, go national, take a big swing. And I heard her, and that's how I'm sort of accumulating these other people's stories to fill out the picture. Yes, fine. And I finally have a proposal that's something enough for my agent to try to sell. That took 2 years, I should say. 2 years of reporting and sloshing around in all this material to make some kind of structure that showed up in a book proposal. And publishers said, yeah, fascinating, intriguing, go bigger, more people, more characters. That is what I kept on hearing. And finally, when I delivered a first draft to the publisher I ended up signing with, which is Abrams, again, it was so through the eyes of the kids that they said, well, that's great. We see the kids, fine. We got your characters, but we don't get how they came to be there. What about the connective tissue? What about the legal? What about the history? What about the brain science? What is all the stuff sort of surrounding them? And this is when I had to kind of reevaluate my original idea about telling the story through the eyes of my main characters. Yes, I could do that where I could, here and there, but it couldn't be the whole book. That wasn't going to answer the reader's questions. So there are points where I step back and I have a whole chapter on the history and how we, starting from the 19th century and how we came to be here. That's not through any kid's eyes. That's me, the narrator, sort of narrating a portion of the American history regarding child welfare. So that happened sort of throughout the book, and navigating that back and forth through their eyes and then stepping out to provide some context was a tricky balance. It took me a long time to find the balance and to kind of land on a structure for it.
To get really nerdy, was it about the way you outlined your chapters? What cracked it for you in terms of getting to that point where you felt like, oh, this is how it's going to sit?
I moved pieces around for a long time. The difficult parts of the book for me were structure and voice, right? What exactly was my narrator voice? If I want the kids to be sort of telling their story, where is that narrator persona? This was difficult. But I think essentially what happened is I ended up structuring the book kind of the way I discovered the answers for the questions I was trying to... The book, I think, is very much structured kind of like following a thread or little breadcrumbs, or you could say sort of unraveling a mystery. I had questions, and I'm assuming a reader will have the same questions, and here is me trying to figure them out. And that was where I kind of got the narrator persona. I'm just going to be, okay, I'm not the genius reporter who knows everything. I'm not. I'm trying to figure this out, just like anybody is. And it, that takes a minute of, okay, I'm going to look like, maybe I don't look smart on every page. Maybe a reader goes, didn't you know that? Why wouldn't you know that? You're a reporter. Well, no, I didn't know it. We're not magic, and we only know what we know by figuring it out. And so the figuring it out is going to be part of this story. And it is. So that ended up providing me some kind of narrative scaffolding. Okay, I'm figuring out this mystery. It sounds really simple, but it took me a really long time to, I guess, surrender to that.
Well, and there are also some points where your voice is really at the forefront and your actions at the forefront too. So there are moments where you kind of show up in this within your interactions with various folks. How did you think about how much of yourself to put into that?
Yeah, again, tricky and dicey. I had written a memoir previous to this, published a memoir. I did not want this to be a memoir. This is not a memoir. This is narrative nonfiction. But I also think it's really, really important to be honest, to be transparent with a reader. And I don't think it is honest to portray sort of a narrative in a vacuum, as if these people just exist and they're not talking to someone. They are talking to someone, the interviewer, me. And I am uncomfortable with a sort of artifice that pretends they just landed there kind of in a vacuum. In the interests of transparency, honesty, and authenticity, I felt like it was important to be real. Also, I think it is illuminating to a reader to see these young people interacting with me, and some not so young people. Art is interacting with me through letters. And I think that is another way into understanding them. Like, how do they interact with an interviewer, with an adult? They're still many of them still quite young. So that was another reason. But primarily, all of these reasons come down to transparency. I want to be straight with the reader about what is going on here. Because, how a person interacts with the world shows a lot about who they are and how they understand themselves. So I thought it was important to show that to readers. Yet, it's not a memoir. I'm not a major character. I am just the reader. I'm the stand-in for the reader, sort of wading through these questions. And I try to imagine if a reader were talking to my characters, how would they interact? What would they want to know? Anyway, that is sort of what governed when and how I would step in.
I think that speaks to a lot of, some of the previous conversations we've had on the podcast, some of the pros and cons of this omniscient voice, where you're not putting yourself as a journalist very clearly out there.
Everybody knows that you are there.
Yeah, exactly. There's also, I thought, a really interesting moment. I don't know, did you loan Marianne something? I'm forgetting. There's a moment, I don't know if you bought them something.
There's a young woman in Texas, Monique, in Houston. And Monique, I would say, is the character in this book. I always feel funny saying character because these are real people, but she is and then I feel funny saying subject because that sounds like royal, like she's not there. I'm not. So Monique is a young woman who grew up in foster care, living in Houston, and really in a very precarious situation when I meet her. But we were talking over the course of years, working together on me telling her story over the course of years. And during that period, I came to understand how terribly precarious her situation was and how very little money she had and how she had been homeless and was on the verge of homelessness again. And she was living in this little apartment and she didn't have any food. And I really wrestled with this question of, well, do I step in? What do I do here? I am a journalist. I'm trying to tell her story, but I don't want to be unfeeling or like cut off from her reality. I really wrestled with this and with this question of how in their lives I could be. And I remembered that I had this very same conversation with the author Andrea Elliott. She wrote Invisible Child, which won the Pulitzer Prize in, I think, maybe 2022 or 3. She spent 10 years getting to know and writing about a homeless family in New York City. And I had the same question. You know them, they don't have a home, they don't have anything, but you do. How do you navigate this? And she said, look, just because you're a journalist doesn't mean you can't be a human being, a feeling person. That has stuck in my mind over the years. And so when Monique in Houston, when I realized how little food she had, and she said she really liked smoothies, I bought her a juicer so she could make smoothies, But in the interest of transparency and authenticity, I say that in the book. I think it's important to be clear about, I'm not in their lives, but here and there, I could offer a little bit of help. And I would explain to them, look, there has to be legitimacy for this book. You're going out on a limb here, sharing your story, and you want it to land with legitimacy. And people have to understand our different roles, your role and my role. I'm not your friend. I'm not your mom. I'm a person who's interested in you and concerned about you. I can help you, with a juicer. I bought somebody else a blanket. Tina, she didn't have a blanket. She didn't have forks and knives. A lot of people don't understand that when kids have grown up in the system and then there they are out in the world, they don't have anything. They can't eat, they're spending what little money they might be able to accumulate on like takeout food because they don't have any cooking utensils, right? Like really basic stuff that is impeding progress. So, I'm not supporting them, but I'm not going to pretend that I don't care about their situation.
This raises some good questions for me about how you engage on two fronts, young people, and then those who have suffered so much trauma in their lives, how you come to them as a journalist in the first place, and what are the things that you do to prepare them for their involvement in a project of this scope?
Right. Well, first of all, I showed them their pages while I was writing them, not early, but later when their pages were real, like here you are in this book, for two reasons. Number one, for accuracy. I want, if I'm saying how they're thinking and feeling and they go, no, that's not right. I want it to be right. Also for agency. And this speaks to your question about sort of trauma a little bit. It also goes to the question of seeing through their eyes. I wanted them to feel like this is their real story and they have some power in correcting me. The power imbalance between an 18-year-old kid just stumbling out of foster care and a 50-something, writer is enormous. And I don't even know if I fully appreciated the enormity of that imbalance when I began, but I came to while doing this project. So showing them their pages was part of kind of giving them back some power. But the point I'm trying to get to here is I did try to prepare them for the impact of a project like this, but I don't know if you really ever can prepare somebody fully for what it's going to be like. It is a very weird experience to be written about, to see yourself on a page. It's a weird experience for me, let alone somebody in foster care. It's a bizarre experience, and especially if you're exposing sort of the most precarious, frightening, vulnerable parts of your life. It's an odd experience. And I will return to your question kind of that you slightly raised about pseudonyms on this point. For people, almost everyone in the book, it's their real names. But here's how I kind of navigated this. I think that my publisher would have been just fine if nobody was a real name. They're like, oh, of course you'll use pseudonyms for everyone. But I'm a 34-year print journalist. We only use real names. We don't use pseudonyms in a newspaper. And this is where I'm coming from. 34 years as a newspaper reporter. I'm not comfortable initially with pseudonyms. It just feels weird to me. So this was where the accommodation we came to. If a person had come to public notice through their case, through like a crime, like Marianne or Art Longworth, or they had come to public notice through their work, like Sixto Cancel the activist. Those are real names. They're already out there, and it would be weird to invent a fake name. People would recognize them. They would know. Some of these people, all of those three people, have been in the newspapers quite a bit. However, in the case of Monique in Houston, who I just mentioned, the young woman for whom I bought a $40 juicer, she really wanted her real name used. She wanted us to use her real name. And my publisher was really uncomfortable with that because Monique is not practiced. She's not a practiced media source. She's not. Goes to the point of preparing people for the impact of being on a page like this. She's not used to it, right? She's not in the newspapers all the time. Also, her story is a really rough story of childhood sexual abuse. And my editor felt, and I think rightly, that she did not understand how compromised her future could be, even more than it already is, even more than it already was when we were talking. I think that he felt she might not understand the full impact of having that history out there. She has enough problems. She has enough struggle. She has enough to overcome. And so we did use a pseudonym for her, even though it's the opposite. Most people, you think they're like, no, I don't want to be in print. She desperately did. But we made a decision that went against her wishes hopefully for her sake, for the sake of her future. There are also a couple of people in the book who work in the system, either as foster parents or caseworkers. And they were, first of all, interesting characters to me, just interesting narratively. And they crossed paths with my main characters. So they needed to be in the book because they're part of those kids' stories. But they were not going to allow it because of their own employment, their own role in the system, unless I used a pseudonym. So for several people who work in the system, I did use a pseudonym because they were important to these kids' stories and because they were fascinating characters whose experience and reality I felt needed to be in this book.
And what has been the response from your subjects and those within the system to the book since it's come out?
Varied. I will say that I wrote the book for the general reader who doesn't know anything about the system. I wrote it for average person who might have heard about foster care but has no idea about this prison overlap or how it happens or anything. So I really wanted to write a compelling, suspenseful, factual, powerful narrative. That was my first goal, frankly. So now when I'm hearing so much from people who either work in or somehow touch the system and are really feeling like, yes, this is what I see. This is my experience. This is what I know. And I'm hearing this so much all the time from people across the country who are saying this is reflecting what they know. So that is fantastic. It's a boon that I didn't expect, I wasn't going for that, but that is what's coming back for me. So that's great. For the subjects, it is varied. I'll say that those who are in better places in their lives now they are like totally into it, fully embraced it, feel like it's really doing something, it's telling their story. I think for those who are in more precarious positions, it's a struggle. It's like I said, it's hard to see yourself on a page. It hurts, It's Tina. I know that she cried reading the part of the book that is her. She said, all right, you didn't sugarcoat it. All right, you were real. And, and she knew that this was what was coming. She said, okay, I'm glad you didn't sugarcoat it, but it's hard. It's hard to see this. And I would say because they're foster kids, they have a lot of armor. They, in many cases, have learned through pretty brutal experience how to protect themselves. So, the book came out in May, and I know that many of them did not read it right away, and that when they did, they would read, go real slow, little bits, because they know this is hard stuff. And I think while they feel seen and heard, which was what they wanted, it's why they spoke to me, this is really painful, difficult stuff.
Yeah. And you mention it in the book itself, which is that there are no tidy narratives.
Yeah, the book ends kind of in freeze frame. These are real lives that are continuing after the book ends. So it's not all tied up with a bow, because life isn't like that,
And I think, it's such a great book, and it's so comprehensive for me, who didn't know very much about the system and the history of it. It goes toward certain solutions, and I thought the really interesting section on the judge, Ernestine Gray, in New Orleans, and what her approach had been, and also her reticence to speak to reporters in the press. I'm curious what that experience is like, speaking with someone who does not really want to be talking to journalists at all. And then also what you found in terms of where there might be solutions that are starting to take shape.
Ernestine Gray is really important to the book because there are two things. She gives us, readers, a sense of how kids come into the system. The book is really geared toward the other end. They're older, they've been in the system for a while. What happens at that end, at the point of aging out and right after? That's really the focus of the book. However, as my editor was saying, but wait, how do even kids get into this system? You have to tell that. And instead of saying, like, here's how it happens, there's a phone call, I want to do it narratively. So again, there's a character showing me both what happens as kids are coming in, how does the legal system, the judicial branch, interface with that decision? Like, how are judges involved? What role do they have? And she, Ernestine Gray, was through her work kind of creating a response. I don't know if you can call it a solution, but a response that is out there. It is part of the discussion now about how many kids really need to be in this system. Are we bringing in too many kids? Because the damage is so obvious. Do we really need to be subjecting that many hundreds of thousands of children to this kind of psychological damage? Like, really? And her work embodied that question. Her work was, I'm just not going to do it. I'm a judge, and I'm just not going to take all the kids into foster care that the caseworkers are telling me I should. I'm going to really adhere to the letter of the law, like, explicitly and literally. And if the law says you have to have tried family preservation services before you take kids in, I'm going to ask the social worker, what family preservation services have you done? So I thought it was her role in the book is important because it shows what happens in a courtroom. It shows what could happen if more jurists used her very stringent criteria. And because of the outcomes of her approach, which essentially ended short-term foster care in New Orleans for the time she was on the bench. She is now retired, and that trend is sort of swinging back. But what she did was essentially bring foster care down to double digits in a city of, like 75,000 people or something. She essentially ended short-term foster care so that the only kids who were really in the system were the very, very few who had to be. And this was incredibly controversial because people said, you are leaving children in unsafe homes. It is a totally valid question and criticism, I think. What kind of justified her approach, at least in her mind and in the mind of some pretty powerful researchers who look at foster care, is the question of, well, are those kids that you sent home or that you placed with their auntie or their grandma, are they coming back in the system? Is CPS showing up at their home again and putting them in front of you saying this kid's being abused? No, they weren't. Now, that doesn't mean that it was like perfect in those children's lives. And they show up in the judge's courtroom and she says, no, you're not going into foster care. You maybe you can't live with your mom. You can go live with, Aunt Jean or something. There are legitimate questions about that because then that case is closed. That child is now placed with their auntie or their grandma or whoever, and that's the end, So does it all go perfectly? Probably not. We don't know. Maybe it does. We really don't know. So she is essentially using a lack of information, lack of knowledge as a justification for, well, they didn't show up on the, in CPS case rolls again. So that's something. I am raising that because I think this question nationally about when do we leave kids in homes that look like they're struggling and when do we pull them out is a moving target, right? It's a question happening now with much debate that is not settled. And Judge Gray's chapter shows the effect of what she did and the questions it raises. So to your point about how do you get a reticent or reluctant subject to speak with you, Judge Gray was one of those people because she had been excoriated by media in New Orleans for this approach. I did with her what I always do in that kind of situation, not so much about people who are who feel burned by media, but people who are just reluctant. I just say, can we just have a conversation? Just like I did with Marianne in jail. I'm not looking for an interview. I want to just talk to you. I just want to bounce my idea off you, see what you think about it. I just want to hear kind of where you're coming into this whole thing. I'm not quoting you. I'm not writing it down. We're just talking. I don't want them to feel like they're being grilled. I want them to feel like they're meeting somebody, me, who really wants to understand their experience and their perspective. And then we could talk about where will we go from here. Okay, Judge Gray, what you're saying is so fascinating to me and so important. Could we have another conversation? And can I record it? And I will show you what I'm writing because I want it to be right. You will not, tell me something and then I vanish and you never see or hear from me again. And then there's a book. It won't be like that. I'm just sort of going real slow, step by step. And that usually gets you a good ways down the path.
What advice you have for other journalists who are thinking of covering the foster care system or more broadly issues that young people are facing right now?
One thing about this that was really difficult is the way the state sort of pulls this shield of confidentiality across the system and across many systems, but especially systems involving young people. This is very difficult. It makes it super hard for journalists to really scrutinize anything. And the state will say, all states will say, we're doing this to protect children's privacy. And that all sounds very nice. But in fact, everybody I encountered who'd been through the system was dying to talk to me. So, the state can say they're protecting children's privacy. What they're really doing is protecting themselves. The state is protecting itself from scrutiny. So for reporters who want to write about kind of youth issues, it is difficult. There's certainly no way and no reason really to interview a 6-year-old. It just doesn't make any sense. They're not going to be able to really provide much insight. But teenagers have a lot of insight. And one of the, I think, ongoing themes of the young people I spoke to in this book was feeling like nobody was listening to them because they're teenagers. Oh, you're a teenager. Oh, you're an angry teenager. Even worse. You're a traumatized teenager. Worse still, right? Like we devise all these reasons why they're unreliable about their experience, which I'm going to say is just nonsense. It's not true and it's not fair. So for those who want to write about young people, teenagers are great because they have a lot to say. And while you have to do your due diligence and check things and run down facts and nail it down, a teenager can deal with questions. They can be challenged. They can refine what they're saying. I think I've done a lot of good stories talking to teenagers. So that's the first thing I would say. And that is true for covering education as well. Some newspapers will say, if you're talking to somebody 18, you must get their parents' permission. Fine, you should. Foster care, it's not going to be like that. You're not going to be able to talk to a foster kid who is presently in the system unless the system has vetted it and allowed it and then trotted them out for you. And that's not a terribly, it's a very choreographed kind of conversation in those scenarios. And that's not really going to do much for you as reporters. Of course, we're always going to okay, you're on deadline, you got to talk to a kid, and they give you a kid, and we know what that is. You do what you have to do, but if you have the time and the bandwidth to do a deeper dive, a longer project like a book, I would say advice is take your time. You have the time, take it. Listen keenly. Listen when the subject's story seems to be veering in a direction you didn't think it would go, and you maybe don't want it to go, right? Like you think that you know what your story is and you want them to speak to this, but they go over here, some other place entirely. Let it happen. It's a difficult thing to do. It requires relinquishing control, and you need to let it happen because you might find a kernel of magic there. Surprise is magic in journalism, right? Like surprise is the glittering stone, at your feet that you didn't expect to see. That might be your lead, a fantastic theme, an idea you hadn't thought of. Let the subjects show you something that you didn't presuppose. I would say that's pretty good advice.
Claudia, thank you again.
Sure. It's been great to talk with you.
Thanks again to Claudia for joining us, and thanks to all of you for listening. If you like what we're doing with Nieman Storyboard, leave us a written review and a rating in Apple Podcasts or Spotify. You can also share this podcast with a friend. We'll see you soon.